Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about Kriya Yoga, Reincarnation, and Rebirth. So in Kriya Yoga and other yogic paths, people often believe in the idea of reincarnation. And by this, they're talking about the Atman, the soul, being incarnated in a body. The soul reincarnates through its will and guidance with higher beings and so on into a new body. Within that, the idea about karma affecting the bodily vehicles that the soul uses to express its outward mission. And from this particular perspective, there is a distinction between the ego and the soul. The idea that the soul, the Atman, is an indivisible piece of the divine, part of God. And the soul is perfect in essence, and it cannot be destroyed, it cannot be created, and so on. It is one and eternal. With the Param Atman, the great soul or spirit, there's a distinction between ego and soul as having an impermanence, as having defilements, as having all of these things that make it not perfect, not a perfect reflection of soul. And hence the idea within yogic paths is to eradicate the defilements of the ego and express one's pure soul consciousness. From a yogic perspective, they'll often talk about the ego as kind of a conglomerate of things, of feelings, that the soul is not the feeling, the soul is not the body, it's not the mind, it's not the emotions, all of these kind of things. And that these relativic aspects are really part of the ego, the false self, the pseudo-self. And so some have taken the perspective of to destroy the ego and to allow the soul consciousness to take precedence. And so really that speaks to the idea of trying to improve one's everyday experience and to go beyond limitations, to let go of things that no longer serve the greater good or one's own existence, which is definitely a theme that runs across all spiritual paths. And certainly when we talk about the Judeo-Christian religions, you see the Ten Commandments. As well, in many other religions, they have tenets, right? Patanjali's Yoga Sutras has the yamas and the niyamas, these religious observances and things to avoid, with the understanding that when one initiates an unwholesome action, you're going to get unwholesome consequences. It's basic understanding of the mechanism of the law of karma. But in yoga, they have this dichotomy between the soul and ego. And the idea that the impermanence of the ego is one of the distinguishing factors between the ego and the soul being perfect, eternal, unchangeable. And so they make this clear distinction between them. They want to eliminate ego and have the soul as to be ascended. The thing is that in everyday experience, there is preconditioned states of mind which lead to reactivity. That goes without saying, regardless of what brush you want to paint it with, if you want to say it's ego consciousness or whatever. It happens. And it's happening because there's something preconditioning the reaction, and one must make an effort to overcome that reaction in a variety of ways, some of which are more effective than others. And certainly when people are trying to adhere to particular kinds of moral tenets and avoid unwholesome behavior, without replacing it with wholesome behavior, it often leads to mixed results. But one of the distinguishing features between ego and soul, about soul being permanent and ego being impermanent, is not verified by empirical testing in meditation. And so the reason this is said is because when one starts to go into states of meditation, one starts to become aware of the fact that any kind of experience in meditation is impermanent. And what often is taken to be the soul, a manifestation of the soul, especially bliss, ananda, which is one of the hallmarks in Kriya Yoga and other yogic paths, as having attained connection with the soul, this experience of ananda, of bliss. As one becomes more adept into getting into deeper states of meditation, one realizes that that bliss is not permanent. So if the idea that a lasting permanent soul is ananda, right, has the basis of ananda, bliss, and one has gone into meditation realizing that this ananda is impermanent and subject to change, also subject to suffering, one realizes that identifying with one's experience of bliss does not turn it into the soul. And so the idea that there's a difference between the soul and the ego is, from the perspective of permanence, a mistaken idea. So the bliss states are impermanent. Likewise, one's experience of a reactivity in daily life, what one may call ego consciousness, is also impermanent. So there is no real distinguishing feature between both of those states, except the nature of the state, the nature of bliss, which is obviously more enjoyable than suffering. So definitely take the point that one would rather experience higher states of awareness than lower states of awareness. But that doesn't mean that there's a permanent, lasting sense of self in bliss, that there's a soul that is based in bliss. It is an erroneous interpretation. And likely this arose because few people could get into that state. And so it may have been that when people had glimpses of a state of ananda, a state of bliss, that they were so overwhelmed and so happy that they identified with that as a permanent, lasting self, saying that is the soul, that is a reflection of God, or part of the continuity of God's consciousness. But in actual fact, if you go into meditation and you realize the transitory nature of that bliss realm, of those experience of bliss, and that there's something beyond it, it makes you really question that definition of the soul. And so where does that leave us? Because we know that karma is definitely in operation, that when one initiates action, that there is going to be a result, there will be consequences, that unwholesome actions lead to unwholesome results, that wholesome actions lead to wholesome results. Both of them are karmically binding, meaning that the results will come from them. But where the real stumbling block, I think, is in many types of yogic perspectives, yogic thought and so on, with the idea of identifying with a particular phenomenal experience and saying that that is the self, that is the soul, that is the I, that is mine, that is myself. When one does that, it is a misinterpretation of what one is experiencing. And this makes sense if people haven't gone very deep in meditation, because they haven't seen the other side of what they started to intuit. But when you've gone through it and seen what it is, then you realize that all experience is transitory, that identifying with any particular state of awareness is a misperception, that likely the idea about the soul and the ego is a false dichotomy, that they are both impermanent, both subject to change, both subject to suffering. But does that mean then that there is no reincarnation, that there is no rebirth? Well, from my perspective, I say that there is rebirth, but not necessarily reincarnation. The difference between these two things have to do with the nature of the soul. Reincarnation is about taking a perfect, impermanent, lasting self, called the soul, and then saying that that soul reincarnates. It goes yet again into the next birth as that soul. Rebirth says, on the other hand, that there are phenomena that are dependently arising, meaning that there is a cause to those phenomena and there is an experience of the phenomena, and the consequences of those actions will carry on, meaning that they could carry on to the next birth, meaning that the actions taken in this life have karmic consequences for the next life, for the next rebirth. But that does not mean that there's a permanent lasting soul that incarnates pure again into the next reincarnation and then carries that karma. And so there are many that may disagree with this perspective because they see a key aspect of their belief system has to do around a permanent lasting self, the Atman. But if one goes deep in meditation to see things as they are, one realizes this sense of permanent lasting self cannot be found. And so this identifying with eternal phenomena in meditation is really a misperception that doesn't allow one to clearly see what is happening. And hence one's spiritual development will be impeded. But if one learns to see things as they actually are in meditation, to go to the deepest levels and not to identify with what one is experiencing, one will see the truth of existence, and follow the path to true awakening. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to send me an email at info@modernkriya.com. Also check our website at modernkriya.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.